Welcome, everybody. My name is Tommy Chai, and I am the coordinator of GRADNAS from the Australian National University. I'd like to begin with an important convention that we follow by acknowledging and celebrating the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present. Welcome to the second seminar of the 2024 GRADNAS Seminar Series. It is lovely to see our live audiences, and greetings to those of you who will be tuning in later to view our recording. This series is convened by Professor Manjit Pardesi from Victoria University of Wellington, who is here with us today. The aim of the series is to showcase the excellent research of emerging scholars working on historical international relations of Asia. As Professor Pardesi highlighted in our first seminar, there has been a global and a historical turn in international relations scholarship in recent years. Scholars are increasingly examining Asian history to enrich international relations theory. This series aims to explore theoretical insights that emerge from studying Asian history. We investigate whether Asian history provides us with new concepts and understandings of order, challenges the received meta-narratives of international relations theory, and whether these findings can illuminate other parts of the world. Ultimately, we hope to understand what these insights tell us about the emerging world order. Professor Pardesi is Associate Professor of International Relations in the Political Science and International Relations program. He is also the Asia Research Fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. His research interests include historical international relations, great power politics, Asian security, and the Sino-Indian rivalry. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Professor Pardesi, who will introduce our second seminar and speaker today.
Thank you very much, Tommy, and good day, everyone, wherever you are. Good evening from here in New Zealand. We are delighted to have you join us for Naosuke Mukoyama's talk. Now is Associate Professor of Global Governance at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. Before joining the University of Tokyo, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, and a junior research fellow at Wolfson College. He received his DPhil in international relations from the University of Oxford in 2021 after completing his LLB and MPhil at the University of Tokyo. His research agenda is broad and centers on the emergence and development of the sovereign state. He's interested in state formation, resource politics, and historical international relations, mainly focusing on East and Southeast Asia and also the Middle East. His work investigates how sovereign states were formed outside of Europe and how the state formation process led to various political issues in these countries. His first book has just been published by the University of Cambridge. It is called Fueling Sovereignty, Colonial Oil and the Creation of Unlikely States. And there's a very nice photo of him, at the ISA book stand with his newly published book. So congratulations on that. He's a very prolific scholar. His articles have appeared in numerous outlets, including the European Journal of International Relations, Comparative Politics, and Democratization. His research projects, apart from the resource curse, also include people's perception of the geographical scope of Asia, as well as the territorial order in early modern Japan. And it's in that context, in this final context, that he's going to talk to us today about his paper on peacemaking and state making in early modern Japan. So over to you now. Now it's going to speak to us for about 30 minutes or so. And then I guess he did circulate his paper to Tommy and I, so we do have some questions for him. It's an excellent paper, so I can't wait to have him talk to us about it. But Tommy and I guess we'll kickstart the discussions, and then the floor will be open to everyone for questions and so on. So over to you now.
Oh, thanks so much, Manjit and Tommy, for inviting me and for the introduction. So I'm just gonna share my screen now. Hope you can see it. Then slideshow. Right. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so Manjit, Tommy, and I were on the same panel at ISA in San Francisco this year. and it was on historical international relations in East Asia. And there were a few other panels on historical IR in East Asia, or Asia generally. And I think it is, I mean, not exactly emerging. I think it has emerged, some decades ago, but it's, I think, a thriving community. It's a growing community. And I'm really excited that there is this seminar series on historical IR in East Asia now. So I'm really honored to be invited here. Usually, a merit of being based in Japan, so I'm at the University of Tokyo, is that there is close to no time difference from Australia. But I'm actually wasting my privilege because I'm currently in the UK and it is 9 a.m. now. But I'm still glad that we could find the time that works for both of us. So my work that I'm presenting today is about how peacemaking, instead of or in addition to war making, affected state making. So this is part of my bigger book project, tentatively called the Eastern Cousins of Westphalian States. I mean, it's nowhere near completion. I'm still at the early stage of this book, but the book I think will tackle two questions. One is, how unique was the European sovereign state system? This is not exactly a question because I already have an answer, which is not that unique. There's this assumption in IR that so the characteristics of the sovereign state originated in Europe and spread to the rest of the world through European expansion, and there was nothing like that before the arrival of Europeans in other parts of the world. But I'm trying to say that this is not the case. I mean, in my case, the case I'm using is Japan, but even in non-Europe, there were some elements of the sovereign state system before the arrival of the Europeans. And that's what I'm trying to show in the book. The second question that I'm tackling in the book project is, how do insights from early modern Japan impact the theories of state formation? And the first paper I published recently in this project is my EJIR piece on the development of linear borders in early modern Japan, which tackle the first question because I was saying that linear borders that are usually thought to be original to Europe actually existed in early modern Japan as well. So that was about the first question. The second paper I presented last year at ISA is about how territory was formed in early modern Japan. I argue that it was a bottom-up way rather than top-down. That was tackling the second question because I was just looking at the early modern Japan case without comparing that with European cases, and saying that if you look at early modern Japan, you actually find something different from existing theories. And the paper I'm presenting today is also about the second question. I'm looking at the early modern Japan case to find some new theoretical insights about state formation. So I don't really think I need to explain much about the Bellicist theory to this audience. But Charles Tilly famously argued that war made the state and the state made war. Which basically means that you need to prepare for war, and in the process of preparing for war, you accumulate capital and coercion, which leads to the development of state structure. And with the developed state structure and the military, you conquer other neighboring countries, neighboring states, and integrate them into your territory. And then you prepare for another war and you repeat the process. And in the end, a strong sovereign state emerges. So that's the Bellicist explanation of state formation. And there have been quite a few responses to Bellicist from non-European perspectives. And I think we can group them into two categories. The first one is those that link the absence of war with weak states. Jeffrey Herbst, for example, focuses on the continent of Africa and argues that low population density in Africa made territorial control less appealing, reducing the number of war for territorial gain. And because of this absence or scarcity of war, there has been underdevelopment of states in Africa. And Centeno, another example, focuses on limited wars in Latin America, and saying that this actually led to the limitation in state development in Latin America. On the other hand, the second group argue that despite the absence of war, there were strong states in some parts of known Europe. Fuan Khan, for example, in their recent article, focus on ancient Korea and Japan to argue that it was emulation and learning from China rather than war making that contributed to state formation in these countries. Jason Sharman, in his recent article, also focused on the relationship between slave trade and state formation in Africa. So basically, these studies find another cause of state formation because war doesn't explain the development of the state. What these two groups have in common, however, is that they start from the absence or scarcity of war. But the case of early modern or Sengoku and early modern Japan is kind of different from those cases because at first glance, it looks like a typical example of war making and state making because there was this period called the Sengoku period in Japanese history, which is between the late 15th century and late 16th century, which was a period of constant wars. Sengoku literally means warring states period, similar to ancient China. And actually, the term Sengoku warring states came from the terminology in Chinese history. So it was a period of constant wars, and there was a certain level of state development in this period. So it's kind of easy to connect the dots here. One might say that this war-making process in the Sengoku period led to state formation. But we also need to pay attention to the period right after the Sengoku period, the early modern period between the late 16th century and 1868, which was a period of general peace. There wasn't really any war in this period. So comparing these two periods, we know that there was a significant level of state formation by the end of the early modern period. There were linear borders, there was mutual exclusion, there was centralization, there was bureaucracy, but we don't really know if this is because of war making or because of something else. So what I'm doing here is a chronological comparison between different periods in Japan rather than geographical comparison between Japan and Europe or some other polities. So a bit of historical background here. The Sengoku period started with the decline of the Ashikaga shogunate, which started in 1336, and it used to claim the entirety of what Japan meant at that time. But with the decline of the shogunate, there was the Sengoku warlordism since the late 15th century. And out of this fierce competitions between different warlords, there emerged some unification attempts by the strongest Sengoku warlords, daimyo, first by Oda Nobunaga, then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu. This process started in the late 16th century and eventually led to the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, which lasted until 1868. So these were unification attempts, but not exactly unification per se. It was more like limited unification through submission, not conquest. And the central authority only controlled a small portion of lands directly. And there was what's called the multiplicity of states within the state situation in early modern Japan. If you look at this map, you can see that the areas colored in yellow were controlled by the shogunate, and the rest of Japan was controlled by dozens or hundreds of different kinds of lords, most notably the daimyo. So you can see how little land the shogunate actually controlled, and the rest of Japan was controlled by domains, and domains maintained significant autonomy throughout the early modern period. They still recognize the higher authority. They recognize the authority of the shogunate as central authority, but the higher authority did not directly control the individual domains. The central authority did not, for example, directly impose taxes on people in domains, or they were not able to arrest criminals in individual domains. They couldn't enter the daimyo residences in Edo, in present-day Tokyo, which sounds a bit like embassies today. So what I talk about in this project is not state formation at the Japan level, but I'm talking about state formation in individual domains. So I want to sort of highlight this because it could be quite confusing. So I see Japan not as a unitary state, but as a hierarchical international system in which there was a higher authority, but it wasn't in control of individual states. And there was state formation process in individual domanial states. So what's wrong about war making? I'm not saying that war making did not contribute to state making. I think it did contribute to state making in early modern Japan, I mean in Sengoku Japan, but it can also create obstacles to state formation. That's the argument I have. There are 3 points I'm going to make. First, constant warfare prevents border perpetuation. Institutionalist theories of international borders argue that borders produce joint gains, including peace, trade, and investment. And if borders are clearly demarcated, they bring stability and predictability in interstate relations. But if bilateral relations are conflictual and unstable, the two states cannot expect their borders to be mutually agreed upon and perpetuated. And considering that linear borders are one of the criteria for statehood, the level of state formation remains underdeveloped if borders are not defined. So if there are constant wars, then you can't really delineate the borders clearly, which sort of undermines the level of state formation. The second point is that war making requires the cooperation of subordinates and actually empowers them. So the lord of the state, the head of the state in question is sort of in the process of state formation. So he has not established his dominance over the population and his vassals. So he could theoretically, try reinforcing his power vis-a-vis his vassals through, centralization attempts. But if there is always the possibility of foreign military intervention, then there is usually only a limited room for the lord to tackle internal threats because defending his territory from external threats becomes his priority if there is always the possibility of foreign invasion. And to defend his territory from foreign threats, he needs support from his subordinates for this purpose, and then that would allow the vassals enough independence, autonomy, which is a problem in terms of centralization. The third point is quite simple. War making is costly and it can deplete resources for non-military sections of the government. So Tilly himself, for example, notes that there is a trade-off between the war-making machine and civilian sections of the government. And as long as war-making is prioritized and the overall resources are limited, the state would find it really difficult to find financial resources for building infrastructure or delineating policing borders or education or increasing productivity and many other things. So that's the third problem, paradox of war making. And I argue that peacemaking can offer solutions to these problems. I'm not saying this is the only solution. There could be many different solutions, but this is one of them. First, if there is no longer a change of borders, then states find it both necessary and beneficial to demarcate their territory and perpetuate their borders, so that it becomes, clear who controls which land, and the fact that the borders will no longer change creates stability and predictability among relevant actors, and it makes it easier to conduct trade or investment or communication. And second, because rulers no longer need to be preoccupied with constant war-making, they are freed from dependence on their subordinates for mobilization. They can implement centralization projects without worrying much about tackling foreign intervention and the rebellion of their vassals at the same time. So that's the second point. And the third point is that so when the financial burden of war making is lifted, it's kind of natural that states can spend more money on other important projects, including building bridges or increasing productivity, among other things. And it leads to the institutionalization of the state and an increase in state capacity in general. So various sections of the state other than the military grow larger, and they obtain more significance in the administrative structure. So what I'm going to do in the rest of my presentation is to look at the case of Sengoku and early modern Japan, and see if these claims apply. And I focus on territorial demarcation as well as centralization and bureaucratization in the rest of my presentation. All right. So the case of Japan. What I'm gonna say is that basically in the Sengoku period, there was this war-making mechanism, but during this period, there were only non-linear borders, and the vassals of the ruler of each domain ruled their fiefdoms independently. So it was quite decentralized. And there was no institutionalized non-military sections or organized bureaucracy during this period in the Sengoku period. But this changed in the early modern period, in the period of peacemaking. So there was significant territorial demarcation, and the vassals were detached from their fiefdoms and they were turned into bureaucrats. And there was centralization and bureaucratization as well. So let me start with territorial demarcation. So in Sengoku Japan, as I have already mentioned, there was always a battle. There was a battle after a battle, and it resulted in constant changes of borders. And there are a few interesting phenomena that were seen in this period, one of which is what's called Sakaime Ryoshu, which translates as border laws. They control a relatively small territory in a frontier zone between the territories of competing daimyo, and they were sort of loosely aligned with one or more of the rival clans, but they did not officially become their vassals. So they usually switched sides between two Sengoku daimyo in conflict. So they didn't really belong to either of the domanial state, but they sort of still remained independent in the border zone. I think the background to this is that there was always the constant struggle between two competing daimyo, and there was a need for buffer zones, which led to the creation of border laws. Another interesting example is what's called hande or hanno, which means the half payment of taxes. So there were villages that paid taxes to two lords in half. So you pay 50% of your tax to one lord and the other 50% to another lord. These are evidence of significant limitations in territorial control, because in order to establish a strong state, you need to clearly demarcate your territory, and across borders there has to be mutual exclusion. One's territory cannot be another's, so you cannot rule the same territory with another state at the same time. But Sakaime Ryoshu, Hande, and Hanno, they were sort of the evidence directly against this state formation. But in the early modern period, there was the decree of comprehensive peace called Sobuji Rei, which marked the end of fighting and the end of territorial changes. And the central authority actually promoted land surveys in individual domains. It was previously quite difficult to conduct land surveys in the powerful vassals' lands in the Sengoku period, because they did not like intervention and they ruled their fiefdoms independently, as I mentioned. But the individual daimyo in the early modern period succeeded in using the promotion by the central authority as leverage against their vassals, and they conducted meticulous land surveys and established territorial control over their lands. And there was border delineation in the early modern period as well, following numerous boundary disputes in the 17th century. And as a result, there was no Sakaime Ryoshu or Hande Hanno anymore in the early modern period. So in sum, there was the development of territorial demarcation and effective control of territory after the introduction of general peace in the archipelago. Here are some examples of how territory was demarcated in Japan. This is a map of boundary areas between Hachinohe and Morioka domains. The two domains had a conflict over the use of a river, but they solved the issue through negotiations, and they reached an agreement. And they eventually exchanged maps depicting the boundary. And the black dots you can see in the map, each of them is a boundary mound built along the borders. So boundary markers sometimes looked like the one on the left, which are boundary stones, and the one on the right are boundary mounds. So the territory was often clearly demarcated linearly in early modern Japan. So let's move on to centralization and bureaucratization. In Sengoku Japan, there was this culture of gekokujo, which means the overthrow of superiors by inferiors. So the daimyo, the ruler of individual domains, they themselves were actually formerly just a small local lord or even peasant, but they rose to power through the mechanism of gekokujo. And if they could become a ruler through the mechanism gekokujo, there is always the possibility of the vassals taking over the lord. And the house of the daimyo was actually essentially an alliance of smaller clans. So it wasn't like the lord, being dominant, always dominant vis-a-vis the vassals. And there was always the mobilization through local laws and in order to wage a war, and which allowed significant autonomy of subordinates, because the lord was quite dependent on smaller clans. And the vassals maintained the right to tax their own fiefdoms, and the structure generally was quite decentralized. However, in the early modern period, there was no more war, which meant that the lord didn't have to depend much on the vassals anymore, and there was no more excessive spending on the military. So as a result, the daimyo succeeded in detaching their vassals from their fiefs and turned them from autonomous lords to bureaucrats. They were successful in imposing direct taxation, and they provided their vassals with salary in rice or money rather than allowing them to tax their own fiefdoms. And this period also saw the expansion of the state and differentiation in state departments as well. And the central authority actually was promoting this move for centralization and bureaucratization because it was also interested in making clear who rules which domain. And it was also interested in denying the culture of Gekokujo because the central authority, it was the central authority for the time being, but if the mechanism Gekokujo was still in play, then it's always possible to be overthrown by individual daimyo or some other actors. So the central authority that guaranteed peace was interested in the promotion of centralization and bureaucratization. So what are the implications from this study? I'm not denying that war-making was important. It was certainly important, but peacemaking was also essential in certain phases of state formation. So there might be, some phases in which war-making has a more important role, and then there are some other phases in which peacemaking can do a better job. It's also this study also suggests that there might be different mechanisms of state formation in different types of international systems. I'm thinking I'm thinking that there might be different mechanisms in anarchy versus hierarchy, and we might find a specific type of state formation under hierarchy. The reason why I'm thinking about this is that, as I said in the previous slide, domanial state formation was actually facilitated by the higher authority, the guarantee of peace, denial of Gekokujo, and support for centralization are examples of that. So maybe under hierarchy, the higher authority actually contributes to the state formation by guaranteeing peace. And in a way, if you think about this, the shogunate in the early modern period might be similar to something like an international institution, international organization. So yeah, this thought is still underdeveloped, but this is a possible implication of this study. Yeah, so this is pretty much my presentation, but I just want to finish the presentation with a shameless self-promotion. Well, Manjit has already kindly mentioned my book, but I recently published this book called Fueling Sovereignty. You might think that this is completely different from what I just presented, but I'm generally interested in state formation and sovereignty. And in this book, I look at how colonial oil politics created certain unlikely states, including Brunei in Southeast Asia, Qatar and Bahrain in the Middle East. So I answered this question: why did some colonies achieve statehood individually while others did not and became part of a larger state? And I answered this question with two factors. One is colonial oil production, and the other is what I call the protectorate system, a specific type of colonial administration.